It's been a long time in our community where I think ICS or OT or whatever we want to call it by is kind of pushed in the corner a bit, or, oh, that's that other stuff, or is that even a thing, or that's an add-on to this other thing. And it's like, dude, the enterprise is the add-on to the ICS. And so it's just been wonderful over the last 16 years to see our community grow, to become the community that it is, where we can get thousands of people lining up to come to the conference to share their insights. It's just really, really beautiful. And I will say this as I kick off: there are plenty of still loud voices in the community at any given time that don't peddle hope, that talk more about tearing down people than building them up. And one of the things that always just makes me so excited about the SANS community and the people that come to it is these are folks time and time again that'll go work the 12 to 15-hour shifts out in the substations and rail lines and similar, and still come and talk about hope and growing the community and educating and going and talking to students and similar. So just be that part of the community, because that's what makes it beautiful. So I'm going to kind of click into the next slide here. So for my keynote, I'm going to be talking about the ICS security and review. I'm going to put on my Dragos hat. Hold on. Especially just with the background. There we go. Boom. Now I'm over at Dragos. All right. So the beautiful thing about getting to be at SANS is I get to be an instructor and course author at SANS, and I still get to do my company over at Dragos with a bunch of wonderful folks. And so I'll do a proper introduction now and kind of get into what this topic is going to be and kind of the lessons learned and the data and why we do these kind of year in review reports. So as I mentioned, in my SANS capacity over as an instructor and course author, in my Dragos capacity, I'm the CEO and co-founder over there. We're a company that has technology for like monitoring and doing visibility and detection in these ICS environments. But one of the things that kind of makes us particularly unique is the way we think about making our technology is about having really, really good people on staff. And those folks are going out doing instant response engagements, hunting threats, architecture assessments with folks. We have an intel team that tracks those threats and tries to understand what they are. And I, when I started my career, I started in the National Security Agency side of the house and built out the U.S. government's mission looking at industrial threats. And at that time, it was a big question of, is that real? Is there a real thing of threats that are explicitly interested in ICS or developing capabilities or insights and lessons learned? Like, is that real? And as we built that mission set, it was obvious that yes, there's a lot. And the challenges we were facing was that we were always collecting in the normal places that we were looking for enterprise threats. And it wasn't until we started adapting our collection and getting into substation networks and manufacturing lines and similar that we started collecting in the right places to find those ICS threats. And so to see the evolution of the community for where I would say even up until 2014, 2013 or so, like even the mention of ICS cyber attacks or hey, these things can take down infrastructure, be overly classified in the government side. Nowadays, we're having broad discussions with the community about, hey, how can we get ahead of these things? And let's not freak out. It's not about a phishing email is going to take down the power grid. Like that's not how that works. But yeah, let's stay ahead of this because these are low frequency, high impact events. And when you're talking about things that can impact not only reliability and operations, but safety, it's worth paying attention to and getting right. So when I was coming into the ICS security community, when I first started, everything was anecdotal. It was somebody spoke at a conference and said, hey, I got some secrets, or I know a guy, or I saw some things. And it just wasn't too helpful, in my opinion, to really start understanding trends and broader insights and how can we start getting ahead of these problems instead of just somebody's opinion. And so what we did is starting to create these year in review reports. And then about 4 years ago is when we started them, which was to say, let's take all of our insights that our services team, that our intel team, that we're seeing out in the field, let's have a data-driven view, non-marketing, not pitching anything in the reports, just here is what we're seeing from our perspective that's data-driven on the community and where the community is today. And so it was really our attempt to give back to the community these insights and make them accessible to you all so you can go draw your own conclusions and think about the problems that we have. And again, kind of invest in our community and make sure that we get this done correctly. So let's jump right into kind of the broad themes. As we look back against 2020, these were some of the headlines you would have seen and some of the discussions that were taking place. This isn't the incident response and inside, baseball kind of stuff. This was all very public. Ekins started off the year where it was the first time that we saw ransomware explicitly take an awareness for ICS, computer processes and similar. And, this is something I've talked about for a while now, that a lot of activity we see against industrial sites is state driven. So adversaries that are state actors targeting industrial systems. And one of the realities of industrial is it's very political. Going after energy systems or manufacturing and things like that. It can be, going after critical infrastructure is very state driven, either espionage or potential for conflict kind of scenarios. And there's a lot of value in that to states. But at the same time, there are all these cyber criminals and non-state actors and similar. And one of the things that we've kind of been watching is when you look at the complexity of really causing impact in industrial, it's not easy. It's easy to break in somewhere. There might be a lot of security challenges, but you can't take your IT mindset and look at the ICS and go, oh, there's a vulnerability in a Windows 7 system, therefore it's bad. No, can you use that to cause impact? You have to look at that very closely. And what we've kind of been watching is that the level of effort required to cause impact and cause scalability is so high that the investment required is for states. But what we're seeing now in the community is kind of, you can call it digital transformation, you can call it hyperconnectivity. We start seeing common operating platforms. You start seeing more open standards. And a lot of this are driving a lot of value, but it's also lowering the barrier to entry, lowering that complexity, where non-state actors and criminals can start taking a closer look at our community because there's scalability and investment and return on investment they can make. And I don't want to get carried away. A data point is not a trend, but Ekins represents an interesting data point of an ICS specific or ICS aware ransomware, and wondering if we're going to see more of that. Throughout the year, we also saw like MITRE ATT&CK for ICS release, which I was just extraordinarily thrilled about. Again, I want to move away from anecdotal stuff, and I want to move more towards what's the data. And there's a lot of value in saying, here's what we've learned from attacks and intrusions before. Here are the common tactics and techniques of our adversaries. Get off of chasing every single indicator. I want to know this IP address or that digital hash. That's not scalable. It can be useful, but it's not scalable. Getting into how are they operating? How are they achieving effect? What's the style of their attacks? That's very, very useful, and it is scalable. And it's something we can take a close look at and have a compendium, a compendium of knowledge that is driven off of exactly what the threats have done. There's a lot of value in doing consequence-driven analysis. What is the art of the possible in our industrial plants? Regardless of who or what attacks it, what can be done? There's a lot of value in getting in there and looking at it from that lens, and a lot of good engineering work going into that to reduce some of the risk of what's even possible in our facilities. But there's a lot of art of the possible. So to also know and pair it up with what's the ground truth reality? What are the adversaries actually doing? Not all 10,000 things they could do, but what are the 100 things they're actually accomplishing and doing? There's also a lot of value in that to help in things like prioritization. And again, we started seeing lots and lots of different ransomware effects, very targeted intrusions and transmission system operators in Europe. Ekins started popping up again in multiple facilities by May. The Ripple 20 vulnerabilities got a lot of conversations going. I think the impact was lesser than people realize. It's very hard to use the vulnerabilities in a reliable way in industrial environments. However, the point that it accentuated was a good point that many have been making in the community for a while, which is we don't really know what's in a lot of our products. And you might see a vulnerability for one vendor, but 5 other vendors may use the same coding library or similar, where they all have the same vulnerability, but only that one issued the advisory because that was the one that got told. And so this topic of like software bill of materials or SBOM or like what's in our products is an incredibly important topic that we'll just continue to hear about in the supply chain security discussions. I was pretty sad to see adversaries targeting pharmaceutical companies during a global pandemic. It makes sense, actually, as much as we want to yell about it, it makes sense that a state actor would try to steal the recipe and the intellectual property associated with new and emerging vaccines, their own intelligence community stealing things to help their people in terms of manufacturing and copying that. We can get upset about that, but to some understanding, that's what intelligence services do. I can understand that. It was the adversaries that were looking to potentially target and disrupt those processes or manipulate or use misinformation to destroy the public confidence in the vaccines. Those are the ones that were just extraordinarily over the line that we were seeing a lot of. And then we're just seeing a consistent trend of just more and more vulnerabilities. What I thought was particularly interesting, and this is one that is something to watch, is the U.S. Treasury came out and sanctioned a Russian lab for the Trisis malware. Trisis, also known as Triton, that was the malicious software leveraged in 2017. It was the first ever cyber attack to explicitly try to kill people at a petrochemical facility in Saudi Arabia. And what I enjoyed about that is it wasn't a name and shame strategy to throw their names up on a Wild Wild West poster or whatever. It was an OFAC sanction from the Treasury. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the sanction process, an OFAC sanction from the Treasury, it basically puts you on the same level of ISIS, and it says you're dead internationally. Like, nobody's going to do business with you. Nobody can go visit you. Nobody can, any banking sector that's related to you, hands off. It is an extraordinarily powerful sanction, and it was the first ever sanction that we saw as it relates to an ICS attack. And I thought that was interesting. And they explicitly called out in the sanction the fact that the reason they cared so much was because it was ICS and because it was that targeting. And when we get national level buy-in and amplification that there's something special about ICS and maybe we shouldn't be targeting that, that's a great thing for our community. And it's not going to solve the problems. It's not like adversaries are going to be like, oh, okay. But it's the start of a dialogue between states that I think is useful. And we'll talk some more about the SolarWinds stuff throughout the conference, and I'll mention some points here today as well. But we also saw a large growth in threat activity, and this gets so many different opinions about threat intelligence and threat activity, and I try to keep it professional, but I will say it is always interesting people's perspectives on what intel is and isn't, and how many folks that have no experience in intel at all are happy to tell you everything about why intel is wrong. And here's my perspective. If you like the idea of learning from an attack or learning from an intrusion and sharing those insights, that's all intel is. It's not magic secret sauce. You should absolutely do your security audits. You should absolutely invest in all the other parts of the business before you're going and, layering on intel. But intel is that kind of secret sauce on top, if you will, that 5% of, hey, let's make sure the things we're doing are right for where we want to go. And let's make sure that once we get to a defensible place, that we're informing our defenders to help move the defensible to a defended state. Let's figure out how to incorporate intelligence to understand those lessons learned. It's not about taking a feed and rolling it across your data. It's about watching trends and understanding how you're going to prioritize your limited investments. And when we look at ICS threats, how we think about it is not just the threats that are developing capabilities today, not just the ones that are taking down, power sector in Ukraine or similar. Instead, we look at it from any threat that is explicitly targeting ICS. We want to know the ones that are hitting the enterprise right now, but they have engineering documents and they're going after just the accounts and people on the operation side of the house, or when they get in, they're stealing out engineering drawings and HMI screenshots and things like that. We want to know the adversaries that are explicitly interested in them so that we can help prioritize it for the defenders. The goal isn't to say, here's one macro group that represents all threat activity ever. It's to say, hey, you've got limited time and effort. If you care about these types of problems, here's an understanding explicit to that. And as I mentioned, kind of when you look at the trend in the threat landscape, for years, we didn't have a lot of insights. And there was a lot of cases that dealt with ICS. If you look back in 2010 and 11, the APT1 reports that came out, fantastic reports looking at China breaking into different sites around the world. There was a lot of ICS stuff in there, but not explicitly called ICS. And the community wasn't at a place culturally even to be able to get into those industrial environments and see anything. But we were seeing intellectual property getting exfilled out of manufacturing environments. We were seeing engineering drawings and SCADA work getting pulled out. So we knew it was happening, but we didn't have the collection to say anything. And so what I normally tell people is don't freak out about the threats. It's not, oh my gosh, everything's getting worse. It's as we collect more, we're seeing more and we're getting a better picture of what's actually happening. And what we're seeing is some of those threats are learning about ICS and then developing capabilities and doing disruptive attacks. What we see is some are at the early stages of their learning. and we want to track their evolution, but maybe they will get to attacks, maybe they won't. And so you kind of follow that hurricane path, if you will. And one of the things that we highlighted in the report was that the threat activity is growing at a sort of three times the rate of growth. And what that would mean to us is if we haven't seen a group in over a year, any intrusions related to them, we would deprecate them, saying, hey, we're not tracking these. These are kind of inactive groups. But what we're looking for is how fast are new groups appearing versus how fast are groups deprecating. And we would hope for a 1 ratio. You'd accept kind of a 1 to 9 of like one new group comes in, one group drops off. What we're seeing is for every one group that drops off, 3 groups appear. That's not a great trend. So it's something to watch. I'm not saying it's alarming and all that. It's just showing that around the world, more and more state actors and non-state actors now are becoming interested and focused and capable in ICS at the same time that our community is becoming more hyper-connected and accessible. A lot of people talk about IT/OT convergence. I usually talk about kind of that digital transformation with that threat convergence. That's the intersection that I'm watching that I think is interesting, that I think we need to stay ahead of. Because a lot of the security efforts in industrial for big companies can take a 3 to 5 year journey. And we're in a 3 to 5 year window of hyper-connected common environments with adversaries developing their insights. So again, not alarming, not freak out, but we need to pay attention to this and we need to get ahead of it. So as we dig into kind of what those groups are from this past year, there was 4 that we kind of brought to the discussion. One is actually one you're probably already familiar with to some degree, but we sliced it up a little bit more to be kind of the things that we thought were interesting to ICS. So Fireeye tracks Sandworm. They do a fantastic job in doing so. And Sandworm has been involved in a lot of different activities, everything from Ukraine 2015 to the Olympics in Pyongyang in South Korea. But the reality of Sandworm is it's a definition. I think a lot of people look at these intel names as a name. That's that team. That's 1-to-1 ratio with that team. These names are really definitions, and I don't know, and you don't know what the definition to that team is of Sandworm, the ins and outs of it. What you do know is that good people are tracking a team and briefing you on updates about what that activity is doing. So as we looked at Sandworm and the things that we were tracking related to it, it hit a lot of ICS stuff. It hit a lot of non-ICS stuff. As we started focusing just specifically on the ICS portions of it, last year, the US government, the NSA actually came out and said, hey, here's some interesting activity with this XM campaign relating basically mail headers. And they said, this is something we attribute to the GRU, the Russians' military sort of intelligence unit. And it overlaps very broadly with Sandworm. And so we took a look at that, and it was something unique, and it was unique intrusions, and it was unique data, and it was a really good job and from a government sharing perspective. And we were able to use that data to then go find additional intrusions and work with utilities that were seeing unique intrusions. And we were able to pull this together to say, look, it's not just like there's this one broad Sandworm team to us. To others, that's fine. To us, there's a lot of non-IT stuff, or there's a lot of IT stuff they focus on. There's kind of the actual team that develops malicious capabilities, like developed the crash override malware in Ukraine 2016. That's somebody we track as Electrum. But what Comosite is to us is the team that's actually going and breaking down the doors. They're the access team. They get in place, and then someone else comes in and moves in. And it's easy to think about GRU or Russia and say that's them. But the reality is they have their own development shops. They have their own allies. They have government labs that work with them, et cetera. So this idea that one threat name represents like one team sitting in the basement somewhere has always been off, in my opinion. There's a whole supply chain that they have, hacker for hires, exploit developers, lab researchers, et cetera. The focus is how can you take the intrusions and the activity and focus it to a level that defenders can use it. Not look at me, I'm an intel analyst, I can track all the cool things, but how do you piece it together of this is what you, Mr. Utility, care about. This is what you, Mrs. Manufacturing, you care about. That's the stuff that we try to do. And with Comosite, it was really cool and interesting to see the access development team, the team that goes in before someone else comes in. So the main thing to focus on here is if you were to see Comosite related activity, The takeaway is you can't just assume that activity is related to reconnaissance. This is one of the few teams that if you see them, you should be prioritizing the detections and response efforts against that type of activity, because they have demonstrated both the capability and intent to line up the team that then comes in to do the destructive attacks, or I should say disruptive. Stibe Night was another really interesting one. This was interesting for a couple of reasons. I'm not getting into attribution on this. Don't really care to. I don't think that's the value. But I thought this was just a really good work. So Cisco's Talos team identified the original Poet Rat malware. They did a fantastic job diving through that. We took those insights, kind of expanded it out, went and found a bunch of other intrusions and found some unique targeting. And the targeting that was particularly interesting to watch here was that the Stibe Night team is explicitly targeting wind generation resources in Azerbaijan. They're not targeting anything else that we can see from our collection, not going after anything else. And the interesting thing about that wind generation capacity is there is no operational wind generation capacity in Azerbaijan. Nothing's up and running. There's multiple projects, there's multiple facilities getting built, but they don't have a wind generation capability today in Azerbaijan. They want one terribly bad. They want one because, as we understand it, they would love to not be dependent on Russian natural gas or other fuel sources. And energy between states has always been hyper competitive. And so for Azerbaijan to be able to be more energy independent is a national security goal for them. And Stibe Night is specifically going after all of the companies involved in that. The construction companies, the companies making the wind turbines, the companies that are going to be operating it, they're getting a foothold early on before even the operational capacity turns on in that country. And Azerbaijan has had a really interesting year where there's also darn near armed conflict between them and Armenia. And you've got, I'm not going to expound too much here, but you've got Saudi Arabian resources coming in to support Azerbaijan and helping build out energy assets. Azerbaijan has made sort of different trade agreements with Ukraine to provide wind energy resources back and forth between Ukraine. And then Armenia has more sided with Russia, if you will. And the idea of having energy dependence and not being dependent on Russian fuel is an interesting geopolitical topic to watch. So again, I'm not trying to describe attribution or saying anything like that. It's what I think we're observing here, what I would assess we're observing are the early stages of trying to get a foothold in their energy independence. And that could have broad strategic impacts for what's going on in Azerbaijan. Now, for all of you in the rest of the world, I think it speaks more to a strategic level. It's not use these indicators and go look for these things, but how are they doing that? How are they accomplishing it? How are they planning on their targeting? What are they looking for? That's all stuff that can absolutely be useful to you. You may never have Stibe Night come after you, but if we can talk about the tradecraft, the TTPs, the tactics and techniques that they leverage, this is stuff then that you can pick up and defend yourself against any other team that uses those same type of TTPs. So all in all, pretty useful there. Another one that was interesting that targeted a lot of Japanese, Taiwanese, and U.S. electric utilities was Talonite. Now, a huge kudos to the Proofpoint team. They picked up some of the initial phishing emails going out in the community and wrote a fantastic blog on it that I put down there in the bottom. Had some really cool insights that they developed. And they'd actually flagged this email as well. And we went and worked with a number of utilities, got some additional information, found some additional intrusions, went and found this email, loaded up in VirusTotal, pivoted off of there, found additional intrusions, and started making this broader view into the ICS specific portion of it. Now, again, it's not saying these folks are leveraging exploits and vulnerabilities in ICS. That's not the point. It's saying this group is explicitly targeting utilities. So it's not hitting banks and other things. And the ways they're doing it is explicitly going after the engineering side of the house. Even the theming of their phishing emails and similar, it's all about getting to engineer and surveyors and their license renewals and anything they can do to get to the engineers and operators. That gives an example and an assessment of motivation on the adversary to be targeting the industrial side of the house. And therefore, as we care about that, it ends up being something a little bit more prioritized for us to go take a look at. Again, anybody working at a utility or manufacturer, oil and gas company, et cetera, you've got 10,000 things to look at in a day. This is not about saying, oh my gosh, we've discovered something that's going to solve everything. It's about saying, out of the 10,000 things you have, here's 3 that are really interesting on industrial side of operations, if that's what's interesting to you. And so the focus there and the consistency of this team to target US utilities and try to get access, and they have had successful access before, and we've worked a number of cases with our clients to make sure they can get ahead of any sort of ICS specific access. Those are a cause to watch this team and to see how it evolves. And this could be a team that falls off in a year and we learn some things we share to the community. It could be a team that continues to develop their insights over the next couple of years. So that's kind of, again, that hurricane path I was talking about following. Another cool one that we saw was Vanadite. All the names we come up with, by the way, are just made up names. It's all industrial minerals. Everybody has their own naming convention. For us, we just use industrial minerals because we're not trying to say like it's China, it's Russia. We're trying to say here's something you should focus on. The interesting thing with this group is the U.S. government has already come out and said this is related, or has said that the broader context is related to the Chinese government. So it's been interesting from their attribution to say they care about it. What we saw and what we were able to find is that this group specifically is targeting the kind of the virtual private servers and the remote access into industrial sites. And at first, when we saw this, and we saw a number of intrusions targeting, virtual private servers and kind of vulnerabilities that had come out like one day before against, firewalls and remote access points and similar. We didn't even know if it was ICS at first. It was like, well, this is interesting. You could leverage this to get ICS, but I don't know that they are. Then we started seeing the focus picking up explicitly on those systems that were related to infrastructure, community, especially oil and gas and manufacturing, are getting hit a lot. We started saying, okay, well, if you're hitting oil and gas and manufacturing, maybe there's kind of the desire to get into the operations environment. And then consistently with, feedback from our customers, they were seeing targeting of those remote appliances that were explicitly the access points into industrial systems. And this is a good observation for most people, where I think for years there was an expectation that ICS was segmented and off the internet, or at least highly segmented, or you had to go through the enterprise to get there. So a lot of companies prioritized their defenses in the enterprise networks. It made sense if you believed your stuff was segmented and only could be accessed from the enterprise. What we found time and time again over the years is that actually integrators, original equipment manufacturers, even just the necessity of doing operations in general, have set up lots of remote connections, have set up a lot of connectivity. And you don't have to go through the enterprise to get there, or you have to go through somebody else's enterprise to get there. And so these remote access points and these capabilities to get in directly to the ICS by bypassing all of those other systems is of lot of value to the adversary. And it's definitely something you should be prioritizing, because we see adversaries like Vanadite explicitly targeting those and getting access to those systems. So when we look at the activity groups we had already tracked, this year we focused a lot on kind of the new folks. The existing groups out there that we track are still active. Many of them are. We see them picking up, different vulnerabilities going after the energy sector. We see a lot of interesting water hole intrusions, specifically themed on like project and engineering sites and integrators. See a lot of targeting of integrators to get access to broad sets of industrial environments. So there's still a lot of activity going on. We're focusing on the new to educate on the new, but I should note that that many of those groups are still active. So make sure you're good with those. I think it's always a thing in our community where we're going to focus on kind of what's the latest, even though we might not have actually applied the lessons learned from the last couple of years. There's still companies I know that haven't applied, instant response plans for what a Ukraine scenario might look like. Those are good places to start. So then as we transition from the threats and we start thinking about like, what's the true state of vulnerabilities? I think the thing about vulnerabilities that I find interesting is if you're an IT security coming into ICS security and you look at the plant and its operations, right off the bat, you think, oh, wow, these old unpatched systems. So many vulnerabilities. Almost you want to take a shower, right? You walk in, you're like, you're using Windows XP still? What? And I think that's really not the point. And it's not a great way to approach the industrial operations. In IT security, you're largely dealing with system and data security. Protect the system, protect the data. In industrial control system security, you're largely dealing with system of systems security. Sure, I've got access to an HMI, but what is that going to allow me to do in the environment? How do I make the lights blink? How do I, cause an overpressure event? How do I cause these systems to work together to do something? Additionally, in enterprise, you deal with a lot of high frequency, low impact events. A lot of stuff happening, lots of scans, lots of emails, et cetera. Not too many of them are going to bring down your company. In ICS, we deal with low frequency, high impact events. We see things less often, but when we do, it could be the fundamental intellectual property that keeps your business in as a business. It could be safety related. It could be operations and national security related. They're big events. So to me, an over focus on vulnerabilities is not the way to think about it. It's more about how can I understand what's in my environment? How can I get in a better security posture? How can I start looking for the behaviors of the threats I care about? How do I look for exploitation of the vulnerabilities I care about, not just patching, because patching isn't always accessible. But that's not to say that vulnerabilities aren't important. But when you look at the state of vulnerabilities, it's pretty bad. And so over the past 4 years, we've been highlighting that the vulnerabilities are not the same value as they are in the enterprise because they often have errors. They often lack a lot of context. And many times the patches don't even actually fix the vulnerabilities. And so we wanted to have real data to support that. And so generally speaking, we find most of the vulnerabilities are kind of deep within the ICS network and control elements and similar. Those ones bordering the enterprise that give access to the ICS are definitely a good place to start with your vulnerability patching. Inside the ICS, I want to get kind of east-west traffic analysis, start understanding how things are communicating, worry about native functionality, because it's not about malware dropping in and doing something. It's about an adversary abusing native functionality in those environments and how to do that. But getting access is a big point of the story. So focus on the bordering the enterprise ones to start with. Then look at the impact. Your CVSS, the scores around these things are not going to be the best way to view it from an operations perspective. The way to view it from an operations perspective is what can you do with this vulnerability? We found in 2020 that 36% of the vulnerabilities cause both a loss of view and a loss of control if you were to take advantage of them. Well, that's a good place to start looking at those much more than the ones that didn't have loss of view or control, the 62%. So maybe about 62% of the vulnerabilities were kind of the bottom of the pile for you, and then you should figure out if they really make sense for you. We also found that the vulnerability data is just wrong time and time again. In 2019, it was 30%, but in 2020, 43% of the advisories that came out for vulnerabilities were wrong, had the incorrect data. Either CVSS was wrong, the vulnerability was wrong. Sometimes it was the wrong software or hardware entirely. And so the point I'm saying is not don't patch. I know a couple of you are leaving this presentation going to your security staff saying, Rob Lee said don't patch. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you want to take a risk-based approach to patching, the data needs massively cleaned up with a lot of context added to it because it's missing an ICS where you might have it in the enterprise. The last thing we want to be doing is bothering operations staff to go do something more than they're already doing on data that's wrong or irrelevant. We also found that when it came to the advisories, a lot of them were missing any sort of context or action. We found that 26% of advisories didn't have a patch when they were announced at all. Hey, there's a vulnerability. That sucks. Good luck. And that's not very awesome. I mean, it's good to tell us about the vulnerability so we can monitor or do something about it. But if patching and segmentation is your main strategy, you're obviously being left out in the cold a little bit. We further found that, kind of as we saw that evolution, that 64% of the advisories had no practical mitigation advice, and 61% also had no alternative mitigation. So it was basically patch or don't. And there wasn't, hey, you can restrict this port or you can do these other actions. In many of our industrial environments, you just simply can't patch. It's okay. Don't beat up your operators to the fact that patching has taken down more power sites than Russia, China, and Iran combined. So let's figure out how to do it correctly with the right data. And then, if we're going to patch, make sure that we plan it. But if we can't patch, have alternate guidance. What else can we do? What can we do at a firewall level to take care of ourselves? And so the way that we think about it is actually a standard developed over at CertCC, where they look at it as a never next now. Forget the CVSS, forget those other kind of context. On the Dragos Intel team, what they do is they sit down and they look at it from, are there threats actively exploiting it? Is the vulnerability posing operational issues, or is it wrong, or is it not that useful, or is the vulnerability just giving you native functionality, features that are already present in the system? You don't need a vulnerability to get the password that's already hard coded into it. That doesn't make sense. And so we put everything into that kind of this never next now. And the idea, of course, is to take a lot of things off people's plate. In 2020, 30% of the vulnerabilities fell into a never category. Unless you were just flush with resources, there's no reason to take a look at them. 63% fell into the next. Hey, your next opportunity, next time the plant's down for maintenance, next time you're in there, take a look at these 63%. Only 7% of the vulnerabilities were worth causing a fit over, saying like, we really need to take advantage of this now. Threats are actively going after this, or it has so much impact that we just really need to be aware of it. And so getting into a state with vulnerabilities where you're a partner to operations and not coming in with your checklist saying, why haven't you patched all of these things? It is going to be a thing that's culturally good, but it's also backed by data of the right thing to do from a security perspective. And additionally, like when we talk about the vulnerabilities, again, kind of as we try to modify the vulnerabilities, we look at taking those incorrect data and we look at trying to add additional context to it. Hey, the CVSS is wrong. It's actually higher than you think because the way that we do it in ICS, here's a specific guidance on how to mitigate this or like block things at the port level. Here's context of the operational impact. This is what we do. This is not to say just go get our stuff. This is to say, this is what we do to help our clients. This is the kind of stuff you should be doing as a security team if you're going to go help your operations staff. I see too many security teams that throw a CSV over to the plant personnel that says, here's a list of the vulnerabilities on the equipment. Go tell us if you have it and what you're doing about it. You could provide a lot more value to the operations by telling them, hey, here's the ones we actually care about. Here's the mitigations that you can take if you don't patch. Please let us know if you have this and if you need any help. Again, it's all about collaboration and approaching them as partners. From a engagement perspective and kind of incident response and assessments and red teaming and similar and what our team was doing out in the year, what we saw is that most companies have extremely limited visibility or collection or logging or insights in their ICS. And there's a little bit of bias with this number where obviously clients that come to us to start their journey, you wouldn't expect them to have done a ton of visibility things. Like often come to us for visibility and helping them understand what's going on. And so from a security professional perspective, this one might seem a little obvious, but it's actually a very important stat outside the security practitioner community. Most of your CEOs and board of directors have an expectation that a lot of things have happened in industrial security. Usually they think all the compliance work they've done is related to all the security work that should have been done, or they think that they're just in a really good place anyways, where most facilities out there have taken a patch and segment it strategy. That's their strategy. And so showing the broader community outside of practitioners that actually, broadly speaking, in our cases, in our collection, 90% of the facilities, 90% of the customers we go into don't have any collection or visibility. That is an eye-opening stat. If you ever want to be good with resilience, if you ever want to talk about incident response, you need that visibility and collection up front. We've done a number of incident response cases just in the last 2 months where we're going in and talking to the client and saying, look, you have no logging, you have no data, you have no sequence of event logs on the system, you have no network monitoring, you have nothing. I don't know what you want us to do. Like you're such in a not good place that the best we can do is help make sure you're not still under attack or still going through an incident. And you need to go and do all these different architectural and visibility kind of things. We also see just, again, a lot of poor security perimeters. That's not a stat to say you're doing a bad job. That's a stat to say if your entire strategy is segmented, that those segmentation strategies aren't solid, and it's a poor strategy, in my opinion. We also saw a nice increase where people last year, 100% of the people that came to us that said that they had an air gap had multiple routable connections. We have far less people after that stat went out claiming to have air gaps, but we did find more segmented environments, not necessarily truly air gapped, but as people are getting in there, they are trying to put more focus on that. And we also found that 100% of our incident response engagements had shared credentials from IT to OT, oftentimes an IT Active Directory, doing Active Directory and domain controller work in the operations side of the house. And that is a highway of death. A ransomware operator hit the IT side, go right to the plant side, not a great time. So that's a good one to get ahead of. The other thing, as we start rolling down, and I'll go over into the break just a little here, on the SolarWinds side, we saw so many people call us saying, hey, don't activate the incident response retainers. We're good. We don't have SolarWinds. That like a day later would be like, oh, crap, we have SolarWinds. And what they were finding is that either plant personnel bought SolarWinds and didn't tell them, or they had it, but they didn't have an accurate inventory, or integrators and service providers were using it in their environments anyways, or in some cases it was white labeled into vendor security stacks where they didn't say SolarWinds in the box. It said like, vendor name security solution, and it was actually SolarWinds. And the reality is, if you looked for the technical indicators of the initial intrusion related to SolarWinds, it was compromised software. If you looked for the initial indicators and you had the logs and data, it was really, really simple to say, hey, we saw it, but we didn't see any follow-on activity. We're okay. If you didn't have the logs and the data, what was a simple like 2-hour check then was you have no idea. If there was external connections, if you missed that initial data, if they came in, it was a tier 1 kind of top tier, team. They burrow in, and you have very little chance of finding them unless you do extraordinarily deep, skilled hunting in that environment. And what the public, I don't think, fully captured is there's a ton of industrial facilities that were compromised, not had vulnerable software. They were compromised because that was compromised software all across the world, through things like maintenance links with the vendors, as well as directly in their environments with none of that visibility and logging. Therefore, most of the community has no idea if there was follow-on activity in their ICS or not. That's not a great place to be in. It's okay to try to talk about prevention, but everybody focuses on prevention. How would we prevent the next one? I don't care. On the next one, I don't care about preventing it. What I care about is, instead of having a multi-month or multi-year long process to try to figure out if we're screwed, let's have a 2-day process. And with the right, forensic capabilities, the right monitoring, the right visibility, et cetera, you can be more resilient by having a better detection and response strategy. It's why we push detection and response a lot, because we've over-focused historically on prevention, and prevention eventually fails. Another interesting one is that a number of teams felt very confident in their ability to detect like our red team activity. What we found in 2020 is that 85% of our clients had completely ineffective abilities to detect the Dragos red team on getting to their crown jewels. So not just like we could break into the ICS, but like we could modify a safety system, or we could actually get down into your most sensitive control elements. And so that's not a shame on the security team. That is hey, you may not have as effective detections as you think. And when we do see people that roll out detection and response strategies, a lot of it is host-based logging or like a SIM work. And that's an okay place to start, or it's an okay place to have. But again, you really want to get network telemetry to understand, especially these systems that are largely not able to have endpoints, and a lot with functionality and a system design where people are abusing native functionality more than they need new exploits or malware. You want to be able to see how the systems behave and come together and so forth. And so it's definitely an area for improvement, because again, I can't harp on it enough. If your entire strategy is segment and patch, or maybe deploy antivirus, it's a very preventative focused strategy. You need to also bring up your detection and response. And a good case study of that, this one was a really cool one. What we found is, this was with a locomotive. I got to say that the rail industry, just so many good folks really stepping up to do a lot of good security work. I think they've got an awesome opportunity to do some fantastic things in the community and bring their insights and share it. I've seen the rail industry move this past couple of years more than last decade. And what we found that we're able to do on a locomotive is actually modify the logic directly on controllers in such a way that when the engineering workstation plugs into it, the controllers auto execute the code, and the engineer workstation auto executes code. And we were able to modify the logic in such a way that it propagated malicious logic automatically across the locomotive as engineer workstations were getting plugged in and similar. And the propagation from an engineer workstation to controller of malicious logic is something you've probably heard about before. There's a 2010 case study on doing something very similar in a nuclear facility somewhere. And being able to see that same tactic on different systems in different ways in different industries is still effective is a great place to start. And that's why I talk about like learning the lessons from Intel. It's not about I need an indicator and I need to know who's attacking my system. It's no, here's a viable attack path that we've seen before. We're going to teach you about that. You should go apply it to your systems. Too often I see companies go, oh, we're not in the nuclear sector and we don't use that vendor, therefore we're good. No, does that tactic still work? Does that technique still work? Does it work applied to your systems and your environment? Take a look at it. Let's learn from each other. Let's learn from these attacks, especially since it's low frequency, high impact. We can take a look at the things we see and really dig into them as case studies and stay on top of that. So what an awesome opportunity to go and teach people different things. And again, to see whole industries kind of get ahead of it. So as we boil this all down, as I end my presentation, as we get through all of our lessons learned throughout the year, it boiled down to us for these top 5 recommendations. I like the 20 critical controls and things like that, but I just think it's too much. I think the expectation that you need to do everything in your ICS security portfolio that you're doing in your enterprise security is wrong. There's 4 or 5 things that if you do well in industrial, you've got a world-class industrial security program. We don't need to copy and paste everything over. Most things aren't even effective to copy and paste over. But increasing OT network visibility by far, if you can't see it, can't protect it. I know everyone says that, but it's true. But more importantly, it's validate the prevention you think you have, validate the segmentation you think you have, understand and be able to get to a detection program to see the malicious behaviors in your environment, what you're dealing with. There's so much value that comes from visibility. Seeing failing network cards and battery packs on PLCs that are failing. There's operations value in doing that. The second is identifying and prioritizing crown jewels. You have a lot of stuff in your industrial environments. You can't do everything. And some things aren't worth every security effort that you're doing. The wellhead that's generating $1,000 a day is not the same value as the refinery generating $1,000 or $1 million an hour. And so figure out your assets that make most sense. But then in those assets, what are the crown jewels? The safety system, the engineer workstation, the system that I can modify the most control with, the domain controller that happens to have access to everything. Figure out your crown jewels and start there. Definitely boost your incident response capabilities. We find time and time again that companies think they have an incident response plan, but there's like a paragraph for the ICS inside the enterprise, or it's something like call the plant manager. And then the plant people are like, who the hell are you? And what are you calling us for? Go figure out an ICS specific part of that strategy and go train, go get like a tabletop exercise, go do a tabletop exercise on realistic injects with your operations staff and your security staff, pound for pound, best training and culture, kind of bridge you can provide. Validate the network segmentation. Again, I don't think network segmentation is the best strategy, but most of you historically have depended on it. So go validate it, because we're finding that 80+% of the time it's off. So these are good stats to go to your execs or others and say, hey, we're probably in the 80 percentile, of what the community is. Let's take a look at this. And then lastly, if you're able, separate that IT and OT credential management, specifically with the Active Directory stuff as well. That's rough. Try to get ahead of that the best you can. So just want to say thank you. All of the report and all the data associated with it is down at dragos.com/YIR. So year in review. Like I said, we try to make all this transparent and out to the community for y'all to use. Appreciate you hanging in there.